Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this briefing on the state of play of European data spaces. My name is Javier Huerta, and I'm heading the digital economy practice at Cullen International. For those who are not familiar with Cullen, we are an independent provider of regulatory intelligence with more than 35 years of experience in the electronic communication sector. Apart from tracking telecoms regulation, we also follow developments in areas such as data, privacy, AI, cybersecurity, and digital platforms. As you know, in 2020, the European Commission published its last data strategy. And one of the key actions under this strategy was to foster or to promote the development of European data spaces across different sectors, including, for example, health or the mobility sector. More recently, the European Union has been more focused on sort of creating a legal framework that would enable the development of these data spaces, notably through the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. So now that the new European Commission has actually just taken over, we thought that calendar would be a very good timing, a very good moment to discuss where we are in the development of data spaces and listen to representatives of the European Commission, but also the industry. But to share more details about the event, the structure and the content, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Milena Todorovic, who will also introduce the speaker. So Milena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Javier. Good afternoon from Brussels, and a warm welcome also from my side to all of you who decided to spend part of your day with us today. This event is being recorded, and the recordings will be shared afterward. But please stay engaged, as you can also influence the course of our discussion by asking questions. And you can do so by typing your questions in the question pane. There it is in the panel on the right side of your screen. And feel free to do so at any time during the presentations. We will collect your questions and we will address them at the end of each of our presentations and then in our final Q&A session. So let's move to the topic that brought us all here together. We will talk about data spaces, and although the concept of data spaces is present already for some time, there's still many things that are not completely clear. And that's why we are here together. And I hope by the end of this webinar, you will have better understanding of what the data spaces are and what is the current state of play. And now we will present our speakers. So we have a fantastic panel today. So from the European Commission, we have Ilana Kunkel. She's a policy officer in DG Connect. From Gaia-X, Roland Fadrany is with us. He's a chief operating officer. Then we will have our third speaker from the Eclipse Foundation, a manager of data space program, and it's Javier Valiño. And our final speaker will be Ian Macbeth. He's coming from Ertico as a senior manager, and he will talk about mobility data spaces. So thank you all for accepting our invitation to be here with us today and to share your knowledge and your expertise. I am very eager to hear all your presentations. So without any delay, Ilana, if you don't mind, to set the scene and to tell us more about the legal framework that is already there, but then more about the activities that the Commission is having in enabling this legal framework that we are already having. So thank you, Ilana, and please go ahead.
Many thanks, Mariana, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see my slides, but I assume that it's working well.
Yes, we have.
Okay, perfect. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ilana Kunkel. I work for the European Commission in DG Connect in the Data Policy and Innovation Unit, and we are the unit that is behind the EU's data strategy and also the legislative frameworks, so Data Act, Data Governance Act, etc. And I'm here to provide you today with the EU policy context on common European data spaces and how we see the concept evolving and what the Commission has been doing in that space. So very briefly, to start off from our policy goal, which is to create a true single European market for data. And I'm sure many of the people here are already familiar with our data strategy. So I'm going to be brief, but the European Strategy for Data of 2020 is where we laid down the framework of all of our activities in the recent years with the goal to create a genuine single European market for data, where data can be shared seamlessly and at scale in line with EU values and rules. And for that purpose, we have since developed a cross-sectoral legislative framework which enables this. So we have the Data Governance Act, which has started to apply in September 2023. We have the Implementing Act on High-Value Data Sets, which started applying this summer. And then we have the Data Act, which will start applying in the next year. The second pillar of the strategy, if you will, and here we're not talking about legislation, but we're talking more about funding and other activities, is the facilitation of the creation of common European data spaces in strategic areas and sectors. And that's where I'm going to focus on today. So you may ask yourself what a data space is, and that's a completely fair question because there is still sometimes quite a lot of confusion about the concept. And one metaphor that we like to make use of to describe what we see as a data space is the one of the roads. Because data spaces truly combine infrastructure, so like the road, with a governance framework. So if you want the traffic rules and the road rules that everyone has to adhere to. And by combining the infrastructure and the governance, we want to make sure that everything can flow seamlessly, that all participants know how to conduct themselves safely. So there's a secure infrastructure. In the case of the data space, this could be a cloud. There are clear and trustworthy data governance mechanisms, and crucially also there is an open number of participants. So everyone could drive on the road as long as you do have a driver's license or vehicle that can drive on the road. So to sum it up, a data space is really a federated data ecosystem which is based on shared policies and rules, like a road network if you want. So where does the European Commission come in all this, and how have we been supporting data spaces? So this has really several layers. One of them, of course, is the legislation, which I've already been mentioning. So we have the Data Governance Act, in which we have created more trust in data sharing by establishing this concept of data intermediaries, which are neutral data brokers that can facilitate data sharing by bringing together the data holders and the data users. We have the Data Act, where we promote fairness and distribute the value across the chain, and also support stronger interoperability measures. But next to the legislation, as I've already said, a big part of it is funding. So we support data spaces by investing into them through the Digital Europe and the Horizon Europe funding programs. And I will get back to that in a bit as well. But that's still not everything we're doing. So we're also working on standardization and interoperability to make sure that we can align between different data spaces, but also data formats that are being used in certain data spaces, etc. And for that, we've, for example, been working on a standardization request for a trusted data framework in cooperation with some of our stakeholders, which is where I'm also coming to our coordination role. So a big part of what we do is to coordinate the actions across EU member states, for example, through the European Data Innovation Board. And we also coordinate different data space projects with the help of the Data Spaces Support Center, which is an EU-funded project which has the role to oversee and guide all relevant sectoral data space initiatives in Europe, because obviously there's not only the ones that the Commission is funding, but there are a lot of other initiatives, privately funded, publicly funded by member states, etc., that are also arising. And with the help of the Data Spaces Support Center, we oversee this. Finally, we've also been working on technical solutions. So just to mention simple here, which is a smart middleware solution for data spaces, and other technical building blocks, but also such as the digital identity framework. So this is the broad, the broad picture of what the Commission does to support data spaces. And in this slide, you can see how this all comes together to build a genuine European single market for data. So we have all these several layers of structures that are needed and have been put into place. So the legislative layer in orange, which sets the current rules, it's technical layer in blue, which should address the infrastructure and computing needs to make this possible, but then also the appropriate standards in place so this can happen in a sort of interoperable manner. And then we have the governance layer in green, where we're working with several actors on those cross-sectoral governance aspects. And finally, in what you see in yellow orange here, we have the layer of the common European data spaces that are funded by the EU. So these are those that we've been supporting through our funding programs. But just to say again that these are not the only data spaces that exist. Those are only those funded by the EU. The idea, of course, is that in parallel and next to it, and perhaps in consequence to the Commission-funded data spaces, we see a range of other data space initiatives emerging. And ideally, that's also what we want to support bottom-up and needs-driven initiatives. So this is to mention the DSCC again. I also have Roland here from Gaia-X who will speak today as well, who is also a member of the consortium, so he might want to tell you a bit about it as well. But they have a large offering on guidance and certain toolboxes on data spaces. So there's a lot of information available there as well. So just to put that on that slide for info. So regarding funding, we have rolled out funding of common European data spaces in 2 phases. So there's always a preparatory phase, the so-called coordination and support actions, which have finished in spring this year. And now we're in the deployment funding phase, where we are funding projects that are working concretely on deploying the data spaces. And most deployment actions have formally kicked off late last year. And we have a range of projects planned for the beginning of next year and still for the end of this year. So it's still very much ongoing. So in total, in the Digital Europe program alone, where most funds for common European data spaces are taken from, the Commission has invested 95 million euros into data spaces in 2023 and 2024. And we are also planning to invest an additional 62 million in the 2 coming years. So the funding is something that will very much continue in the future as well. So we will continue to support data spaces in that way as well. Regarding the timeline, I've listed here several sectoral data spaces that we are supporting. And as you can tell, most are rather recent, and the most developed ones that we have now that we are funding are mostly in the health space, where we've seen first results. So in the genome data space and in the cancer image data space mainly. But as you can tell from the EU-funded data spaces, none of the deployment actions have actually been completed yet, and the timelines are rather long, and many projects are still starting as we speak. So that's important to keep in mind that for the common European data spaces that we've been funding, a lot of them are still in the starting lines, if you want. So for some of them, it might be too early to really have conclusions on their success. So to sum it up in terms of what the status of data spaces is and what we think in the Commission has worked well and so far, and perhaps hasn't worked well so far. As I just sort of alluded to, in most cases in the sectoral data spaces, they're still in the starting blocks, but that does not mean that there's not a lot of work that has already been done horizontally and that is ongoing, and that we are working towards positioning Europe as the leader in the data spaces and data governance realm. So I think it's important to keep in mind that as such, the data space concept is still relatively new. We are seeing an emerging market, and those things take time. But I do think that the ecosystem, and that's the view that we share here in the house, that the ecosystem has been developing well. So we've had over 1,000 participants at the last data space symposium. Gaia-X, which Roland is also gonna present to you, has over 300 active members, and there's many ongoing projects. So we've seen data spaces emerge that are funded by member states, privately funded. We have here a German, a French, a Finnish example. So it's really not just the Commission that is active in this space. We've seen a lot of political support for data spaces in council conclusions, for example. So I think those are the positive examples and the positive lines to take overall. In terms of where we could still see potential improvements, again, we are just getting started. The results are not completely visible yet, and long-term scalability and sustainability is still a factor to be discussed. And recently in the House, we've also had lots of discussions about linking data spaces to AI development and how that can be achieved in the future. So that is also future looking, what we're now thinking about in the Commission. Right, and I think that was basically it from my side. I've here linked the 2 staff working documents that we've drafted on common European data spaces that you can have a look at, which sums up quite neatly the sectoral developments and goes into much more detail. So that's just some links that I'm leaving here for information. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ilana. This is really insightful. It's good to see how many activities the Commission is actually having to enable data spaces. But you are talking a lot about funding of data spaces, and I'm wondering, is there a business model for data spaces? Are data spaces could they be sustainable in the long term, or are we talking here only about data spaces that are making available that are going to be funded, or is it something that can be developed as a business model? What is your opinion on it?
That's definitely the goal, and that's what we believe in, that eventually data spaces should be able to sustain themselves and fund themselves. As such, a data space alone is not a business model, so there still needs to be a business model and business participants in the data space to make it viable. But the more participants you have that are willing to share data and also be remunerated for it, the more sustainable it becomes. And I think, again, there are several business models that are still emerging, and it's a discussion that we're having. And it might be difficult to see when you're starting with a small use case, which is usually where our projects start from. But it's, if you keep the broader vision in mind and the more participants you'll get in the more mature data spaces, we do think that they can be sustainable, and they should be sustainable in the long term, as we cannot rely on public funding forever.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that. And if I may, just another question. You mentioned data intermediaries, and we have them under the Data Governance Act. But they also, to be registered, data intermediaries have to be registered in their member states. And in order to do that, we have to have competent authorities designated in member states. And we've seen with the DGA that didn't go really fast as it should have, so that there are some problems on that side. So first is part of the question is, do you expect that this enforcement of the Data Governance Act, and we will see what will happen with the Data Act, is somehow in a way of the development of data spaces? And what will be particular role of data intermediaries, or are they really necessary for data spaces, or is it possible to organize it in some other way?
Okay. Well, let's start with the enforcement question, perhaps, without being, I mean, I really don't like this whole commission bashing member states thing. So without taking this role here now, there have been a range of late designations of competent authorities. We're in fact still waiting for some. Some of the challenges are understandable. I mean, the data market is still evolving. Member states are still adjusting. So are we at times. So it's challenges that we also understand, and we try to prevent where possible. But indeed, it has been one of the challenges with the implementation of the Data Governance Act that in the member states have been lagging behind, but we have been active in pursuing them. So we did start infringement procedures. That's publicly available information. So we had sent a range of letters of formal notice already in May this year, and that's still something that we're actively pursuing to really get behind member states to get behind that and designate their authorities. But I think about the Data Act also, this is a bit lessons learned. So we've now seen what happens. Now the member states have more and more practice in how to enforce data legislation. We have created fora to discuss this. We have the European Data Innovation Board, for example, where member state competent authorities can come together and discuss it. So I'm hopeful and optimistic, perhaps, or carefully optimistic that with the Data Act things can be a bit faster this time around, but we're definitely behind that. And also just to mention that we will have to already evaluate the DGA in the coming year, so basically tomorrow, because we are already at the end of this year. So by September 2025, we will actually have to evaluate the DGA, and then, of course, when we will evaluate it, we'll also look into these questions of why it has been working, what things haven't been working. So that's something that we're very much thinking of. Regarding data intermediaries, well, we have, of course, foreseen a potential role for data intermediaries in data spaces. So the way that we see it is that data intermediaries could have a crucial role in data spaces because they could organize data exchanges. They could, establish the link between people looking for data. If you want people having the data, that could be, a data exploration pooling function, even if you want. But it's not a necessity. So there are different models that you can imagine. You can also have a completely decentralized model, and that's, I think, what Gaia-X is doing. Please, Roland, afterwards correct me if I've been saying wrong things, but there are different models that can be envisioned, and we are not necessarily saying that one model is preferable over the other, but with having those data intermediaries in place, we want to give another option, so to say, so that there are several options available. There are maybe certain sectors in which one option is preferable over the other, maybe in sectors where trust is really of necessity, and you would prefer to go over a trustworthy intermediary organization than over a completely decentralized model, which can also create trust. So it is really a question of, what is needed, what works best for the data space participants. So there is a role to play for data intermediaries, but it's not a necessity in any data space that is emerging, I believe.
Thank you. That is clear now, and I think it will be even more after Roland's presentation. And if you could shortly comment this, is there any connection between data spaces and AI factories? So AI factories started being mentioned in the beginning of this year. As it was part of the initiative to enable AI startups, and as open ecosystems formed around the European public supercomputers. So is there some connection between AI factories and data spaces? How do you see that?
Yes, well, actually, we are currently in the process of thinking about how that connection can be made. And I've alluded to that, I think, towards the end when I said that, part of our future plans and part of our thinking right now is to see how we can link up data spaces to AI development. So, of course, I mean, AI development relies on data, as we all know. And then, I mean, it's part of our thinking to see how we can make that link a bit clearer. But again, this is something that is now for the future commission, so there's not that much that I can say about that, unfortunately.
Probably
But it's definitely something that we're thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for these answers and for your presentation. So we will have more questions in the course of the webinar. But now I will invite Roland to join us and you will share your presentation, and it's good that now you come to build up on this legal framework and activities of the Commission that we heard from Ilana, and that we can hear now what are the activities of Gaia-X and what is actually the role that Gaia-X is having in this deployment of data spaces and the whole development. So we see your slides, but just 1 second. Now I think everything is fine. All right, Roland, please go ahead. Yeah, you please unmute yourself. You can't unmute yourself. Oh my, okay. We have here technical support. Just 1 second.
Now it's working. Very good. So we need to get back to the sharing the presentation. Okay. So welcome everyone. I want to give you a brief overview about what Gaia-X is actually doing. And so I hope this is working. It has a little bit of a latency. Yeah. So first of all, who is Gaia-X? And we heard a bit in the previous presentation. So it's an association with over 300 companies and organizations being part of it. We have no public funding. We are funded by our members, and that is good so, because that means we are representing the industry, and we are working for and with the industry to define data spaces. We have many different organizations, large companies, small companies, startups, universities. It's a big mix of different skill sets and interests that help us shape this trust framework, which is actually in the heart of what Gaia-X is doing. So let me start a little bit about the demand of data spaces. And one of the questions I get most is, do we really need data spaces? Do we need to share data? And my answer usually is, well, you know, that decision has been taken 60, 70 years ago. This is not a question of today, because 70 years ago, we decided that our industry gets more and more specialized. We put a whole process into more and more small pieces and try to deliver them together and optimize that way. In the 50s, a German car maker had all his suppliers about in a radius of about 300 kilometers, and they were delivering 80-90% of the car. Today, those value chains are global, truly global, and a car manufacturer is doing a maximum of 20% of the value creation. And interesting enough, our chairwoman of the board, Catherine Chestin from Airbus, told the same story in our summit in Helsinki 2 weeks ago, because it's the same in the airline industry. Airbus is only delivering 20% of an actual airplane. 80% are coming from suppliers, and there is a huge demand because you need to get all these suppliers and all these data collected from all your parts, your certification of different parts, the behavior in AI, for example. If you want to build a digital twin of a car or of a function in an airplane, you need to have all your suppliers giving you either the data, which they don't want to do because there's a lot of trade secrets, or they give you actually an AI model that behaves exactly like that component, and that you can bring in then into your digital twin. So the only way to get into those levels of many-to-many data sharing is if you decentralize and if you have certain standards in place. Let me give you an example of what we really do. Many countries in the world have agreed that their citizens can, under certain conditions, travel across the different countries. And in order to do so, they have created rules. And one of those rules is that they said, well, you know, we better identify that person. So they came up with the idea of an ID or a passport. And that passport, they said, well, you know, we need to have certain criteria. And when you think about it, the passport nowadays, it has a picture, it has your birth date, it has your name, it has the issuing authority. More recently, it is machine readable. Even more recently, it holds biometric data, and it has a chip, so it's really completely, it's not only OCR, it's really readable by RFID. And we are doing the same for data. We are identifying participants through a trust framework, and we have a common architecture that allows us to interoperate and make sure we allow that travel of data under the rules of the participants. And when you look into one step further, how a passport is issued, that is something that is a national decision. And the same is true for data spaces. So the onboarding process into a data space is something the database authority decides. And also above and beyond that pure passport travel function, there might be other things that you can do with your digital ID. So I live in Austria. I have my driver's license on it. I can identify myself. I have the registration of my vehicles on it. I can do some public services. So there's a lot of functionality, and that is translated to the data space again, something the data space authority decides. And so there might be a data space that has a certain amount of data that is available to any identified participant. There might be other data that is only available if you sign an additional digital contract, and there might be data and data products that you can only access if you really participate in that specific data space. Now, data spaces are great, but we need to be very careful that the data spaces of today are not going to be the silos of tomorrow, because when you look into these different data spaces and you say there is automotive, for example, but automotive was created based on a couple of use cases that were driven by legislation, like the supply chain legislation or CO2 footprints. And so they were really focusing OEM and tier 1, 2, 3, 4 providers. Now, just think about the move we have towards electric vehicles and that push, especially in Europe. So from that moment onwards, there is another data space or industry vertical that is affected, and that's the energy industry. And we have two large Gaia-X projects in that area. One is Omega X in France, and the other one is Data for Energy X in Germany. And these vehicles and the charging will become part of the grid and of the power production and consumption ecosystem. So those two need to talk to each other. And when you think it further, it's also the same is true for smart cities. Smart cities actually are a multi-layer of data spaces that are not owned by a particular city. So how would that trust system then work if it's inside the silo? And the answer is simply doesn't, because the smart city data space or the energy data space would not automatically trust an automotive or aerospace data space. And that can be solved by a common denominator. And that's really what Gaia-X is trying to build, a common denominator that can work across the data spaces so that data space authorities can still use their internal models and their internal rules, but there is also a rule set that is commonly available across industries and across different legislations, because we're not only doing this for the EEA and EU area, we're having a lot of discussions and conversations now with Asia on how to expand this, because those data spaces and those values chains are so global that we need to make sure we have it in all countries. How does this work from a Gaia perspective? Well, actually, we have a governance across it, and then we have the Gaia-X community in different committees and sprints and working groups, and we create basically two sets of documents. We have Gaia-X technology agnostic compliance documents that are laying out the policies and rules, and then we have rule agnostic architecture document that helps us to deploy this, and that is basically our design phase. Then we have the OSS community. That community is producing code. They're releasing software, and that is basically the build phase. So we're doing this all in open source. And then in my role as CEO, I get that product back, because that's the automation of the compliance on the left side. And I hand it out to service providers, cloud service providers, that are running that code on our behalf. So we are not a single point of failure, and we don't have the risk that if there is only one organization, we put it into as many organizations as want to host this. Typically, these are service providers. There's a lot of telcos, incumbent telcos that are running these services. And these services, we have at the moment 10 of those digital clearinghouses. This is what I call the democratization of trust, because what it does is it puts the trust system on many, many different nodes, and those nodes are constantly exchanging information. And so it's a truly leveraged and federated system. How are we going to do trust and how does that work? Just briefly for understanding the model. First, we need the policy. This is done in the PRC, in the policy rules compliance document, and you have a set of criteria in there. Then we have defined the ontology because we need to speak the same language in order to basically evaluate it. And we have permissible standards, and there is an evidence to be presented. So, for example, if it's an email address, you need to present a valid email address, and it can be validated. And then you hand this over into the clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse does a technical validation or verification, and that then is issuing a label if you're passing that. And when it comes down to a higher certification, which is label level 2 and label level 3, you are no longer presenting the evidence on your own. You're presenting a certificate which is signed by an accredited CAP. So make it easier for Germany. It would be a BSI C5 certification issued by Ernst & Young and properly signed. And that is what the clearinghouse, again, automatically will check. So you can basically not only have a trust system, but it's also fully automated when it comes down to issuing those labels. There is three layers of this. The lowest one is for infrastructure. So especially for cloud service providers, we have 3 different layers and labels that are enforcing certain standards and compliance. Then we have 1 layer that is for a participant ID. That's the closest to the passport thing. So it identifies a participant. And then there is a trust protocol specification on top. This is not a connector, it's just a specification we're working on, where every industry and every use case can configure the level of trust and the information. And I give one example, which is a real life example from France. There's legislation that enforces them to produce and track certain data of nuclear power plants, but that data must not be produced outside France. So if they have an infrastructure layer and they are a participant and they have a data product that runs on top of it, and let's say it runs in a data center in Paris at the moment, and there is a failover because there's any problem in Paris and the failover goes to Toulouse, it's no problem, the service will continue to run. But if that failover would go, for example, to Ireland or Germany, the service would automatically stop because the condition for data exchange is violated. This is a simple example how the different layers work together and help to have true sovereignty through the Gaia-X concepts and software. So just to sum it up, data space application, the trust between parties or participants is enabled by the digital clearinghouses. Access to high quality data, which is linked to AI, by the way, is done by the architecture and trust framework. The need for a trustworthy ecosystem is done through the ecosystem and especially the interoperability, the smallest common denominator. And then the global legislation challenge is done by labels and data exchange policy enforcement. And there will be labels next year for legislations outside the EEA EU space. And I think with that, I'm at the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roland. I wondering now, while we were talking, I was wondering, we heard before Ilana, and she presented the legal framework and all these 2 pillars that Commission created, also the activities that they are having. So how much is that relevant for Gaia-X activities? Are we now is Gaia-X having kind of a parallel system that doesn't rely completely or doesn't need the legislative framework that is created by now? So how that works. Is it a parallel system, or is there some kind of a synergy that we have that is from both sides?
It's completely integrated. So we are very close to the Commission. We are reading exactly those things. And for example, when we talk about data intermediaries, I think when people start preparing their projects, that's the moment when they figure out that they are a data intermediary without knowing beforehand. So an orchestrator of a large data space all of a sudden will find himself in the role of a data intermediary. And what our system is allowing us to do is we can put a certain level of automation to that framework. We are not giving you compliance to a data act, but the system helps to be compliant to a data act, helps to be compliant to data intermediary, simple because if you offer a service, you can describe the service and you can sign the service. And that gives you and your customers and your partners confidence in what's going on. So we are supporting exactly that kind of legislation. And this is also the difficult part now, for example, rolling it out in Japan, because a couple of those things don't exist in Japan, or they have a different view on protecting data versus protecting industry interests. And these are these conversations that we now have to see what can we do to identify participants, what kind of regulation is applicable, and sometimes even what standards are applicable.
Yeah, and now when you mentioned Japan, and also during your presentation, you mentioned the event that Gaia-X organized a few weeks ago. It was on empowering global data spaces, if I'm not mistaken. So how is that connected for you? We are talking for today's webinar is about European data spaces, and we have in Commission's its European strategy for data. But is it possible to have European data spaces as some kind of separate data spaces and not to have international data spaces, or not to have all interconnected? How do you see that?
This is exactly why we are having all these talks with those other regions, and also the US, by the way. The industry, especially the European industry, need to be able to exchange data with their business partners in Asia and in the US. So by creating a compatible and compliant system, so interoperability is technical, compliance is rule-based, by creating these layers and the same ontology, we can enable the business to have an educated decision based on transparency. So we are not saying you should not exchange data with Japan or China. We are saying you can see where the data is processed, where the data is coming from, and you can use it or you don't use it, because every decision like this is risk versus reward. And so transparency is something which we need to do together. The decision is always with the people or the industry. And then on top, there is certain industries that are highly regulated anyway, when you think about pharma, healthcare.
Thank you. I see that we also have questions from the audience. So Javier, could you please step in and to read a question?
Yeah, there are quite a few questions from the audience. I have selected two so far. So the first one is if you, Roland, you can provide an example of a current data space use case, that could be given to illustrate, what are the roles of the governance authorities, the participants in the data space. So it would be basically about providing a practical, tangible example of an ongoing data space. And the second one, which I find quite interesting because it is around trade secrets, because this was a hot topic of discussion during the negotiations around the Data Act, as you may remember. So how do you envisage in this overall context of data spaces, trade secret protection? Or if you see any issue with that?
Two excellent questions. Let me start with the first one, an ongoing data space. When people talk about data spaces, and especially when they talk about monetarization of data, everyone has, first of all, a consumer problem in mind. We talk about WhatsApp or something similar. And the difference is the meta model is I give you my private data for advertising and I get an application. Those two activities have zero in common. They are completely disconnected. While on a true data space application, the value of sharing data is intrinsic in the sharing itself. And I give you two quick examples. One is one of our lighthouse projects, Gigant. They have several use cases. One of them is they are producing spindles, and there's two parts. They need to match precisely. And unfortunately, they are produced in two different factories. So when they produce the spindle, the CNC machine is automatically measuring the size and then is registering that data in a data space, and the laser puts a QR code on this piece. The same is done by the other factory. In the past, the assembly process was to bring them together, need to rework them again so that they complete fit because they have tolerances, and then continue the production process. What they do today is the system is matching automatically the two production lines and is pairing the spindles or the components of that spindle of almost zero tolerance, so that you can directly mount them and you do not need to rework them before you go to the next step. So they basically cut out an entire step in the process. A second example is from Cooperans. That's a large aerospace project with Pontus X and with Airbus. And what they have done is they have models, they have data models of construction of components, for example, the satellite cabling. And that's pretty complex. And what they do is you can buy that model in the catalog, and then it's a virtual or an augmented reality model. So you have a special lenses on, and while you are putting that cable inside that satellite, you can actually get all the information. You get instructions what you need to do. You can see the projected plan directly in your work environment, and that helps tremendously. And that leads me to your second question about trade secrets. We have one way of solving trade secret problems really efficiently when it comes down to AI. I told you the example that you have small components that are building up to a system like a car or an airplane, where you need to have small pieces of a digital twin. And this is actually the problem that I had when I talked with the industry guys. And they say, I cannot give you all the data of my component because that would tell you what I'm doing, and I lose my business advantage. But what they start doing is they take all the data they have, create a small AI model of a component that behaves exactly like the component, and then you can either buy or get through this catalog that trained model. And because of the signage and the digital signature and the verifiable credentials, it's proven by the manufacturer of that component that it behaves like it should. And so the next in the value chain can just plug that AI model into their larger model, and they can see how a component works under different conditions like temperature or pressure or whatever it is. So by decoupling the raw data from the manufacturer and building a model that is digitally signed, you can get that value chain going, and you can get your models running without giving away trade secrets.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roland. It's a great topic and interesting to talk more about it. But for the interest of time, we will stop now, and maybe we will have more questions later. And I have a pleasure now to invite Javier Valiño to present. Javier will talk to us more about the technical aspects of the development of data spaces, especially about interoperability. So please, Javier, go ahead.
Thank you, Mila. Hopefully you can hear me well. I'm in a bit of a noisy environment, so apologies in advance. I think the headset is doing big noise cancelling work, so far so good. So great. Thank you for letting me present what we are doing in the Eclipse Foundation in terms of data spaces. So this is what I am going to talk to you about, how we develop open standard specifications and technologies. So let's go directly to it. So On my first slide, I would like to address directly the question that was asked on the webinar itself. So where do we stand in data spaces? And whenever we are presenting this, regardless the technology or the domain, we usually use two figures. This first one is measuring the investment versus the profit that we are making out of something. So we usually start investing a lot, and then you can see how the curve is going down. And then at a certain moment, we start making business out of this idea. So there is a point in which we break even. We start making profit out of the idea. And the other figure we used to use is the one that is being used in Gartner reports, where we measure how the topic is performing. We start usually with a lot of expectations on a given topic. Then we realize it is not as excellent as we were expecting. And for those that manage to go through this valley, they are then adopted and then move into a productivity phase. So this is my very own assessment of these two figures for data spaces. So yeah, I would say we are here for the investment. So we already saw from Ilana presentations that the European Commission is still investing money in data space. Therefore, we are still in the investment phase. So the goal would be trying to go down the valley and up again whenever we are making business out of data spaces. And we are here more or less as well in this other curve that it is usually illustrated in Gartner's reports. We have been working in data spaces for several years now. So we went down the peak of inflated expectations, as they call it. And now we are in a moment in which we need to prove that what we are doing is really making value out of the data that we are having. So I am not trying to convey a negative message here, just a reality check that we are in these two valleys, let's say. But the good thing is that it is up to us to go along the curve and start going into the bright part of the curve. So it's up to us. Let's make it happen and keep this in mind. For this to happen, we need to start turning our investment into reliable business models. And why are we here? So this is what I see that was happening in the previous years. So we were sharing data for quite a long time. It is not new technology. You can share data bilaterally with any other party in a secure way, in a trusted way. So it is not something technologically wise that it is so far away. So technology is ready. Then, as we were also mentioning in the two previous presentations, we are having a big regulatory push, especially in Europe. The European Commission were issuing in 2025 from the strategy for data, and then several regulations were following, such as the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act. So there is a framework of regulation at the European level that is pushing for data spaces, because if you read into the Data Act, they are saying that the way technologically wise to achieve the digital single market is through data spaces. Then we started as well to work in the different associations in the data space ecosystem into what Roland already told you. The compliance documents, the architectural documents, specifications, our labels. So we needed this work also to be in place. And also, thanks to the Gaia-X Lighthouse projects, plus the projects that are funded by the European Commission, both in Horizon Europe and now starting in Digital Europe, we are starting sectorial data spaces. So we are moving on this line. But if we are trying to provide something, what is the big picture? I am happy that the webinar is structured having Ilana first, then Roland, and then me, because it is matching this idea I am trying to convey with this slide. There are several layers on the data space ecosystem, and we are trying to collaborate with one another. If we start from the
Javier,
top part,
excuse me, just
yes.
our participants are saying that they can't hear you very well. Is there anything that you can do on your side to improve the quality of the sound, or there's no room for the improvement now?
Yeah, I can try to move to find another spot, but it would take me some minutes.
It's all right. Let's continue then. You have also slides. I hope they will be able to follow your story.
Okay, sorry for that. Okay, so as I was saying, starting top down, we have the part on policy, regulation, legislation. So that is what the European Commission is doing with all the acts that we already saw, and also what is being done through the data spaces support center, for instance. Then we have a layer which is for specification requirements architecture, which is where we can see primarily position Gaia-X, ITSA, these kind of space associations. And then there is the bottom layer where we try to position as Eclipse, which is where we provide concrete open source implementation of all the things that we are having from the previous layers. So the idea with this slide is also to provide this vision of a cascading effect. So we are not isolated at the bottom. We are trying to embrace everything that is happening in the upper layers and collaborate with all the relevant actors on the upper layers so that we can drive and provide these actionable results. And what are these results we are trying to provide? So we are trying to answer 3 questions, and you will see this message being repeated on my presentation. First, we detected that there is a problem on interoperability for data spaces. So that's what we saw, for instance, when we are trying to deliver sectorial data spaces. So it's good to have sectorial data spaces, but the long-term vision, especially from the European Commission, is the digital single market. So we need to have also interoperability between these sectorial data spaces. How can we solve this problem of interoperability? We think it should be solved using 2 pillars. The first one is open standards. The second one is adoption through open source SOAP. So this is what we are trying to provide. What are we doing at the Eclipse Foundation? So we are usually known for being hosts of data space projects and also other open source projects. So that's one part of the business we do. The other part is what we call industry collaboration. So you can see on the slide the Eclipse Data Space Working Group, which is an industry collaboration we conduct within the Eclipse Foundation. Industry collaborations are initiatives in which we are trying to gather everybody who is active on a given topic so that we can provide strategy and standardization for a given topic. So as you can see on this slide, on the Eclipse Data Space Working Group, we are working with these strategic members and also some other additional members to provide strategy for open source software that is based in open standards. And you can see some extracts of our charter on the left-hand side, which is basically replicating the messages we saw on the previous slide. We are trying to solve the problem of interoperability through standardization and open source modules. And that's kind of the slide that is trying to summarize everything. Starting left to right, on the left we have the regulatory push we can see from the European Commission, especially with the Data Act, and we are trying to provide these 2 actionable items. First, open source specifications. You can see on the gray part, the pile of standards we are trying to promote at international, but also European level. I will go into this in more details in a few minutes. And with these standards, we are trying to influence and provide a strategy for the open source community so that they are adopting it and they are using them on the implementations they are doing. But why is Gaia-X, ITSA, other data space players working together with the Eclipse Foundation in doing standardization? Because we have the status of pass submitter, as you can see on the slide. What does this mean? This means that the ISO IEC acknowledges that the way we do specification in Eclipse is the right way to do it, and therefore we can fast track the process of standardization. And this is more or less the ISO roadmap for having a technical standard implemented. You can see that it is made up of several parts, and it might be lasting between 2 and 3 years to transpose a given standard. But with the Eclipse Foundation being a pass submitter, we can do our open specification using our rules, our methodology, and then we can transpose the technical standard fairly quickly, as you can see, in less than a year, because we can enter directly in the last part of the standardization process, where we will have just a check from the national bodies about the standard that we are trying to transpose, and then we can apply directly for transposition. So this is what we are doing, for instance, on this pile of tasks. If we start bottom up, you can see that we are standardizing with what we call the base protocol, which is the data space protocol. Then we are trying to standardize as well protocols for claims. Those are, for instance, the credentials that we can issue for identity or for describing our services or data. And as well for what we call profiles, that are a set of rules, formats, and semantics that we are using in a given data space. So this is, for instance, the translation of what we saw in Roland's presentation of the trust framework of Gaia-X. How can we combine these protocols into a fully operational stack made up of open source? So if we start bottom up as well, the part on the data space protocol and the claims protocol are usually integrated in a connector. So connectors that are hopefully going to be developed in the future or adapted in the future will implement these protocols we are trying to standardize. And then on top of the connector, we can have different profiles that are matching the different frameworks we might have in different regions. Here in Europe, we might be willing to adopt the Gaia-X trust framework, while in other areas, they might came up with different profiles. Then we can build on top some additional value-added services, such as marketplaces or observability modules. And there should be a component that is cross-cutting on certification, making sure that those modules that we are providing that are using our standards are certified so that we can know beforehand that they will be compliant and interoperable. And that's everything I had for this presentation. This is just summing up a lot of useful material you can check whenever looking at what we do, and happy to also answer your question now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Javier. That was great. Always useful to hear the technical aspects from things that we are looking mostly from a policies perspective. And I have a question for you. If you could say if these publicly available specifications that you mentioned, can they also serve as a base for a full-fledged standard later on, or is this something that is completely separated?
Well, this is a status that is granted, and it is not forever. So we have to renew it every year. And it is linked to particular subcommittees within ISO IEC. So whenever we were applying for this in data spaces, we were applying for the ATC1 subcommittee 38, which is on cloud computing and data. And therefore, we are entitled to go to the ISO IEC meetings as experts, and we are also entitled to start the transposition of technical standards. So what we do in the working group is trying to first determine how many standards do we think are needed for having interoperable data spaces, and then we start working on them. Whenever we have a release on our open specification, we initiate the transposition. So that's the process of a submitter and how can we interact with ISO IEC.
Thank you. And I will use now the opportunity also to invite back Ilana. Ilana, if you're with us, could you please tell, the Commission has also some standardization powers, and it can request one of the European standardization organizations to draft a standard. So yeah, are there any activities regarding that, especially under the Data Act, the power of the Commission?
Yes, exactly. So under the Data Act, we do have an article where we can request standardization organizations, so also to draft essential requirements and common specifications. What is happening right now is that we're working on a standardization request for a European trusted data framework, so that will encompass several elements, and that is very much ongoing work that we're doing right now, and where we're consulting actively also with the European Data Innovation Board and with our stakeholders. So indeed, we're also working on standardization, as we think that's indeed crucial, as mentioned by Javier, as mentioned by Roland.
And as now you mentioned European Data Innovation Board, it's active, formed, and fully operational?
Yes, it's been fully operational since last December, and it meets 4 to 5 times a year. The next meeting will be next week, actually. So it's active, it's fully operational, and now under the Data Act, we'll also see that we'll take on quite some new tasks as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Javier, if you don't mind, one more question that you mentioned smart contracts and what is, and its Data Act also has provisions on interoperability of smart contracts. So could you maybe clarify a bit what is their role in the development of data spaces and their functioning?
Sure, I can try to do so. Well, just a first disclaimer before we start. It is not something which is specifically addressing what we do in Eclipse. It is something which is general for data spaces. So, for instance, in our case, the part which is ruling the way we negotiate and also create those contracts is on what we call base protocols, and the Eclipse data space protocol is the one ruling this. So at the end of the day, we are trying to reuse as well well-known standards, and the data space protocol is reusing for this ODRL. As you know, this is a W3C standard. So the idea would be trying to standardize the way we exchange messages between the connector and the contracted part of the data space infrastructure, so that we can create those contracts using ODRL, and also we can also clear those contracts. But at the end of the day, data space protocol is trying to regulate the way we structure those messages, while the trust frameworks that are translated into our profiles are providing the guidance of what we should put into those contracts. So that is why Roland was emphasizing the part on labels and also the trade secrets and everything. So depending on the profile you select or the trust framework you are selecting, you will be using more or less restrictive rules into your contracts by default, and also you can provide as well as many rules as you consider necessary for you to participate in the data space. So it is the combination of these two things: technical part on the data space protocol, semantic part on the trust framework.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Javier. That was great. And we will move to our final speaker. Ian will tell us something more about data spaces in mobility, or what is their use, or which kind of use they could have, and what kind of role they could play in mobility. So please, go ahead.
Right. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, but we don't see the presenter view. So if you could, it is switching monitors. If you're using two monitors, I guess that's a problem that we are having now. To switch displays.
Let's try.
Could you maybe try that? Because now we will also see. Now it's not. Nope. Nope.
No,
it's the
that's
same.
the one.
Sorry. It's the same. Because now we see the view that you have as a presenter with the notes and with the second slide that you will have. It's still the same. All right, maybe to stop sharing. Maybe to stop sharing and to share again. If it's not working, we also here have your slides, and maybe we could share them and
let's try it again.
Yeah, just try. Yeah.
Try that one.
Now it's great. Now it's great. Thank you.
Okay, good. Now, technology, eh? Well, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm a relatively newcomer to data spaces, so my background is largely in operational and strategic planning for transport. So we're coming at it, what I'm trying to explain today is perhaps not the policy side of it, the technical side, but actual deployment of a data space in the mobility sector. And as Ilana showed on her slide, the mobility data space is one of the first, if not first, of the data spaces coming online that are funded by the Commission. But let's take it back a little bit. mobility kind of predates the telecoms industry by a few thousand years. I think Roland mentioned 70 or 80 years ago in his presentation. But obviously, we've got different modes. We've had ships, we've got roads, more recently railways, operating independently in isolation from each other. Different countries, different languages, different units of measures, kilometers, miles, different cartography and things like that. So historically, mobility comes from a multitude of standards and, of course, legal conventions that have built up over hundreds of years. So we have different priorities, of course. Railways in the past wanted to control movement on the network and ensure the safety of passengers and goods and so on, but they're in a closed environment. Road operators operate in a very open environment. You've got multiple players on there. If you can have driving license, you can use your vehicle on there. But you also maybe want to manage congestion in cities with traffic lights and things like that. Automotive, OEMs and so on, people who sell cars, they want to differentiate their product. Only a few years ago, actually most cars weren't connected. And I've been through the 5G and the V2X side of discussions over the last few years. But before that, pretty much a car was its independent unit, not under any sort of really any ITS control. Fleet operators, they want to look at fleet efficiencies, sort of petrol consumption, diesel consumptions and things like that. And then cycling, cycling bicycles weren't connected to anything. So how did you work out what they were doing? And a lot of that was informed guesswork. Clearly now we've got a load of e-bikes, a lot of data coming from public bike schemes, but also from private individuals, and sat navs and things like that. And across all of these modes, there's different international conventions designed for these specific applications, done in isolation from each other. Good example, the Eurostat on the right-hand side. So coaches and buses and trolleybus share the roads, but they wouldn't necessarily share data with car manufacturers because they're in competition. Same with aircraft and rail in the past. So they're competitors to each other, so not necessarily wanting to share data. And of course, that means there's very little consideration for the data sharing across those sectors. So as mobility has moved from analog to digital, there's been a digital sort of transition going on there. We've got a proliferation of data sources, mobile phone data, floating car data, sat navs, roadside sensors, e-call for the safety side of things. And what I'm talking about here is mostly road-based mobility. We're not really talking about rail or air for this example. But all of these things are standalone platforms. They're built on different IT architecture. They've got different levels of adoption across the different member states. And there's a legacy of conventions and silos. Even when you transition to digital architecture, in many cases you've just replicated and replaced what was an analog into a digital, but not thinking out a bigger picture. Against that, we've got hundreds and thousands of new players now in the digital data space, and they bridge some of those traditional roles. And of course, as we heard from Eclipse and from Gaia-X, there's an increasing focus on the ownership of the information, the legal requirements, the governance, commercial, financial considerations. And the key point is that just because mobility tends to be connected these days, it's not necessarily cooperative. And as a sub-point of that, it's also a load of closed and open data sets covering a multitude of topics. So I've mentioned about traffic congestion already, but that could be live data, but it could be historic data you want to look at. Curbside restrictions, so parking restrictions, loading bays, those sort of things. Many of those haven't been digitized yet. In the past, would you even look at weather conditions and meteorological data? Would you be able to see accident statistics? Were the police statistics available to public bodies? Were the insurance industry statistics available? So a bunch of stuff like that. Roland mentioned earlier on about smart cities and energy grids and things like that. When you've got electric vehicle charging infrastructure, that all of a sudden starts to make a big interaction with grid infrastructure and demand management from the energy sector and about what you can and cannot do, what you need to forward plan. And there's quite a lot of activity in that space. passenger and road user behaviors. We can now interpret a lot of what people do on a day-to-day basis, which we couldn't do before. And then you've got some of the traditional things about timetabling and online ticketing. But none of these have a uniform catalog or indexing system. So actually making discovery of these data sets is really quite challenging at the moment. So intelligent transport systems, as I mentioned, this really is applying to road, surface transport. And that just gives you an idea of all the different sets of activity that ITS encompasses. You've got safety, you've got multimodality, you've got V2V, V2X payment systems, you've got EVs in there, AIs coming into this thing, we've got traffic management, autonomous vehicles, transport and logistics, as well as passenger transport. So there's a huge number of players and activities going on within this ITS system. Now, Ilana's already gone through this in a lot of detail, really, so I'm not going to dwell on this particular point, but obviously the EU digital strategy is setting out that policy and governance side of things from where we can go forward with the actual data spaces. So we've had a number of acts. We've got the Data Acts, the Governance Acts, Cyber Resilience, Digital Services, the AI Act, and of course GDPR. So all of those play in to the mobility and transport sectors in a way that perhaps never really had to worry about in the past. And I think Ilana's already mentioned, there's 14 European digital data spaces being developed. Mobility is one of the first, and the key point about it is that, I think, as other players or the speakers already mentioned, is the discoverability of the data sources, the quality, the access conditions to get into that data, finding the essential data, increasing their availability, the access and reuse, enable technical organization and legal interoperability, the reuse and data sharing side of things, optimizing data collection and reducing administrative burden, because there are millions and millions of new IoT devices that can provide data that didn't previously available. And of course, it's the facilitation of that interoperability with other data spaces. You can imagine that might be transport needs to talk to tourism, or energy. There's a multiple sort of interoperability activities that can take place. So kind of it's useful just to sort of maybe step back and say, okay, there's a data space. We've heard from Eclipse on the connector side of things. We've had to look at the data providers, but actually, what is a data space itself? And this is quite, for an IT and technical literate audience, this is probably simple, basic information. But if you're from a mobility sector and you're a local ferry operator who doesn't really understand why their data needs to be shared with anybody else, actually starting to understand some of the technical language that we've heard today starts to become important, because some of that language is certainly causing confusion. So it's worth just talking about taxonomy. So data spaces, as we've heard, it's a framework that supports data sharing within a data ecosystem. It's a distributed system, it's got governance framework that ensures a secure and trustworthy data sharing. And that's quite fundamental. But for a lot of people who are not familiar with the terminology, they kind of don't understand what is a data space compared with a data center or a data warehouse or a data store. And I think those are sort of things that sort of is for those not familiar with the technology and the terminology and the principles behind this. That is something we have to explain right from the get-go when we're talking a mobility data space, understanding what the differences between this terminology is. So data space protocols, people, perhaps in an operational perspective, people are looking after buses on a day-to-day basis, distributing bikes on a bike share scheme. What they need to understand is what the data space protocol actually means. It's about the data sets are presented in catalogs, and we've already mentioned that actually there's no single catalog at the moment. It's quite difficult to index that. How the data rules usage is expressed, how the agreements are negotiated and written, and then accessing using specific protocols. again, we've heard from Eclipse already, but interactions with the data space involve those connectors. And of course, you've got the identity providers validating the identity of that connector as well. So these are all part of the taxonomy that people new to the data space, particularly mobility and the operational side of things, need to understand. I'm not going to say too much about this because Javier knows much more about it than I do. But EDC is a common data collector that we actually use in the mobility ecosystem. So this is kind of where some of the linkages between the EMDS we're currently working on comes back to Eclipse and the other layers. I mentioned about the digital index about discoverability of the data sets. The DCAT application profile is kind of being used across the public sector data sets in Europe. It's not just a mobility one, it's used in health. I think the tourism database will be using that as well. And NAPCOR and some of the other EU funded projects and so on are adapting DCAT for that indexing. So it's really about the metadata records, providing that interoperability with other applications using controlled vocabularies. And mobility DCAT AP is an extension of the DCAT metadata, which is actually now being adopted for the national access points. We haven't really heard much about those today, and probably maybe for another discussion, but actually adopting a standard indexing metadata for the NAPs starts to move towards a sort of helping to make that interoperability across the different data spaces much more achievable. NAPs, I will say a little bit about it. It can be a database, it could be a data warehouse and so on, but they are providing discovery services, making it easier to crunch data across the side of things. And it is accessible on a non-discriminatory basis in accordance with standards. And the NAPs are the backbone of the ITS infrastructure, particularly on the mobility data space side. So a little bit about NAPCOR. This is an EU project that's been going on for a couple of years now. And it's really about making that infrastructure, the safety, the travel data accurate and available to users. And it's primarily using transport authorities or service providers at the moment in time. So a lot of the city authorities are involved in this. We've got 36 participants in the NAPCOR project at the moment. It comes to an end this year, but expectation is that will be NAPCOR-X will take the work forward over the next couple of years following the completion of this project, which will then take on the governance discussions that's been had to date, harmonizing the development and evolution of the NAPs so that there is a compatibility and interoperability across the member states, designing and developing the common tools. And one of the key things that has taken place is a sort of DATEX2 standardization. And again, talking about collection initiatives and compliance as well. So NAPCOR kind of is schematic here about how it's working, usual sort of horizontal activities on thing. The working groups on the right-hand side there, if you look at the data exchange standards, you've got DATEX2 and TNITS. They've actually now agreed as part of the project to actually merge and bring the two standards together. So that's the first step of actually adopting a standard architecture for information for traffic management and mapping. So TNITS is the mapping standards, DATEX2 is traffic data, traffic management data. So these are the sort of things that we're beginning to bring together to try and make things a little easier to understand, a little bit more standardized across the member states. And of course, the EMDS itself, this is a project funded by the Commission. It's not a single database of all mobility and transport data. You've got, there are private ones like that, so you've heard from Gaia-X already, but it is a framework for interlinking, federating many different mobility data ecosystems, which have been difficult to access because of that lack of indexing metadata in the past. It builds on the policy that's been and the legal legislation that's been acted by the Commission, but it also takes account of existing data sharing mechanisms and legislations. It's not about trying to build something brand new from scratch and abandoning old stuff. It's about working with everything we have at the moment. And this is a little bit more about the actual EMDS itself. There's lots and lots of platforms. It's about data sovereignty, quality, trust, and so on. And at the bottom there, you've kind of got the components that sit within that. There's 9 blocks we tend to use, technology building blocks in there. It kind of just shows how that flow of the project works. We can go a little bit into this. I mean, there's the architecture side of things. So you've got the data sourcing at the top from vehicles, the crowd, and so on. It goes into the deploy EMDS framework. You've got the data processing happening there with the exchange standards, matching, filtering, etc. And then it spits out into the NAPs. And then, of course, the service providers can access the NAPs as well to actually get some data from there. So that's how the architecture is envisaged. The functionalities we've kind of spoken about a little bit already, but there's value creation in there. We've got the data sovereignty side of things. We've got the interoperability, that kind of thing. And then there's the accessibility. And again, we've got the value creation, the publication, the access and usage controls, the provenance, which then pushes that data out into the NAPs in an agreed formats. Now, this is a little bit more about deploy EMDS. It's quite a big project. You'll notice that Fraunhofer have been mentioned a couple of times today as well. They're part of providing the common technical infrastructure. There's actually 9 cities having real-life deployment sites, as you can see down there. And out of those 9 cities, there will be 16 use cases which will use the common technical architecture coming out of the deploy EMDS. We've got Architect who are looking over at from that side of things. We've got training modules going on. We'll come back to that a little bit. We've got networks of follower cities to try and bring other cities into the conversation, and then there's some basically dissemination activities as well. Now, there's an awful lot of going on there, but there are also challenges there, and I think there's a couple of things here we'd like to just sort of flag. So education, as I mentioned, people are not necessarily familiar with the IT environment. So there's a lot of education. If a city authority may not understand this, they may have an IT department, but maybe the policy department doesn't really get involved in IT. We've heard about the business case today, so that's still being developed. The technical capabilities, again, different authorities have different nuances, different priorities and things like that. So do you have the ability to do that in-house? Do you need to get outside help to do that consultancy? And of course, that then goes to funding. And many city authorities in particular, they not necessarily got a lot of money to spend on it. They've got different priorities, maybe that's health, education, other things. So transport is not necessarily at the top of the pile to have funding for these to actually sort of move towards deploy EMDS or EMDS compliant policies. Then there's a political dimension, and people maybe forget. I mean, the Commission will be well aware of this. We've just had a change of commission, but cities and then they'll have local elections. They have mayors and things like that. They're in post for a while. People may or may not have knowledge of transport or mobility or MDS. So there's an element of education, at least from a political point of view, but then also selling it to the politicians to unlock that funding. Why should we do it? And then, of course, timescales. It takes time. This isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time to get everything lined up and people actually working in cohesively together. So those are just some of the challenges that we're discovering as part of Deploy EMDS. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into where it's going with a particular data space, and particularly for mobility. We are one of the very first, so we're learning as we go along to a certain extent. And undoubtedly, there will be things that we learn and maybe do differently in future and pass that knowledge on to the other data spaces as they develop coming over the next few years. And that was me.
Thank you, Ian. It is really great to hear some specific example and to see where the things are right now in the mobility data space. And we are slowly running out of time, and we received several questions that are related to the connection of data spaces and AI. So I would invite all the speakers if you would like to say something about it. And while you're doing that, I will read one question that is addressed to Ilana. So it is related to the metaphor that you've been using about the road. So the link was made to seeing data spaces at road infrastructure and governance frameworks. However, for example, in the Netherlands, the roads are maintained by the government, whereas in France, there are many private toll roads. So when you mentioned that data spaces should be able to sustain themselves, so the business model, how should I understand that that this analogy of the road is the business model that the cars or data are privatized? Or should I understand this? How should I understand this business model exactly? So Ilana, do you have some comment on this?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we've noticed before that this is maybe where the analogy becomes imperfect, but again, it's just a metaphor, so we don't have to like overextend it. But I think if we really want to stay neatly within that metaphor, the point is that it could be privately owned or it could be publicly owned. I guess indeed with road infrastructure, the norm is that it is publicly funded and owned, and it's more the exception that it's privately owned. So again, I don't want to overextend the metaphor in this case, but just to say again that it could be very much both, but maybe less so than for the roads, that it can be entirely public. But that's a good point. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And about the data spaces, Roland, would you like maybe to say something about it? The connection between AI and data spaces. Could we expect that data spaces are going to serve as a mean to procure data for training algorithms?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something where we have a lot of, we are speaking a lot of conferences about this because the basis for AI is data. And the biggest problem is that data in organizations need to put to work, to be put to work so that they can deliver benefits. And the biggest problem is, as I said, you have quite complex value chains today. So if you only use your own data, the data that you have might not be good enough, not be big enough, and might also be biased for training AI. And that's a big problem. So I think sovereignty and trust in data spaces will give you access to high quality data that is also signed so that you can basically fully understand with which data an algorithm has been trained, for example. And it's also the amount of data that goes in. Take a simple example. We have 10 companies. We collect the data from the 10 companies, but one company delivers 100 data sets and another one delivers 1 million data sets. That's going to result in a biased algorithm. So this traceability is important. So trust is important to get to data, and then you need to have the traceability to understand how a model has been trained.
Thank you. And Ian, Javier, would you like to add something on this or give your point of view?
Nothing specific
Yes,
from me. Yeah, nothing specific from me about AI other than one of the things that we are beginning to detect is whether AI can actually start to read all the different languages and architecture itself and actually solve some of those challenges. So some things could become machine readable that aren't to date because of the way AI can actually interpret the data.
Thank you. Javier, maybe something you would like to add?
Yeah, thank you. No, nothing else that has not been said already. So at the end of the day, we are kind of the enablers for the artificial intelligence part. So we are trying to make sure that whatever they need, it is on the quality they are demanding and it is accessible for whoever is willing to use it. So that's the challenge we are trying to solve. with data spaces to make sure they can start using more and more quality data.
Exactly. Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to be today with you. And big thank you to all our speakers for being with us today. And I will give a word back to Javier for the final wrap up.
And just to reiterate the thank you to everyone, also for the audience, because you were actually quite engaged in the discussion. My apologies for not being able to take over to pass all the questions to the speakers. And if I may, I would like to ask you, one last thing before leaving the seminar, because once you are going to leave the seminar, you will receive a survey where it is very useful for us if you can give us feedback on this webinar in order to improve them. But more importantly, we will plant a tree for each feedback that we will receive. So I guess that's the main reason for you to give us feedback. And so please do that. And yeah, thank you all again, Ilana, Javier, Alan, and Roland for your participation. Also to you, Miliana, for the coordination, and have a great rest of the day.
Goodbye, everyone.